And hello, everyone, friends from near and far. It's really nice to be here to celebrate this beautiful new book of Barry Lopez's, just out earlier this week, Embrace Fearlessly the Burning World. He was working on the essays in this book when he came to Point Reyes. And in true Barry fashion, in the last year of his life, he wrote 4 introductions to the work of other people's projects, which are included in this book. I thought as a way to begin today that we'd have a kind of invocation, one that I actually stumbled upon at Barry's house that he shared with Deborah, where he lived for the last 50 years in Finn Rock on the Mackenzie River. And it was almost a poem that he wrote. And it's titled A Short Manifesto. And I feel like it would set the tone for our conversation today and sort of call forth the better angels of our spirits to talk about his work and what it meant to all of us. It goes like this. In our dealings with each other and with the natural world, we should cultivate an atmosphere of dignity and respect. With regard to the land, we should defer to principles of mutual obligation and courtesy. The power of the land is innate. Its value, if it must be assigned, is deeper and more subtle than we know. Its achievement does not require our permission, nor does it depend upon our compliance. We must announce that the economic dimensions of our national problems are not paramount, that our physical and spiritual well-being are of more enduring concern. We must agree that the greatest of wrongs we can effect is to directly intervene in the process of biological evolution. As heinous must be considered the manufacture and deployment of nuclear weapons. These weapons promise to incinerate our dignity utterly. We need to discover that our grace resides in our generosity and our wisdom in our greater courtesy towards the mystery that contains us. So this was published or written in July of 1984 at Port Townsend, and there are echoes of it today. I think one of the wonderful things about Barry's work and his legacy and the communities that he built through collaborations was that he was constantly calling us forward to respect and investigate the 6,000 mysteries of place. And he sought to travel the world and witness how these living things were operating, how they lived differently. And he strove to be up to the task of describing that encounter of people and living things with their geography as watchers watched the scene and as livers lived within it. And he looked to describe the reasons why we needed to watch things. And in a way, he wanted to describe that encounter. A former photographer and a student of visual arts, I feel like one of Barry's great gifts has been to describe with a poet's line and an ear for language the scale and the feeling of the experience within that encounter, but also with an idea for framing what it felt like to be inside that frame and to reject previous frames, to reject previous narratives. And it's such a pleasure to be here with the people we have for this discussion, because all of them have in many ways followed in or traveled alongside Barry's example of rejecting poor frames and asking for better and more enlarging ones. And so in that sense, I'd like to call forth first the writer Rob Macfarlane, who comes to us from England, where the frame is probably getting towards nighttime. Hey, Rob, how are you doing?
Hey, John. Yep, we're getting there, but it's long nights here. We're fairly far north.
Oh, well, it's a pleasure to have you here. You were a friend of Barry's, but you also encountered his work fairly early in your writing life. I wondered if you could describe to me its effect on you and when and where that happened.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's a beautiful and bittersweet honor to join the people I'm joining this evening to see this international gathering around Barry's memory. And of course, the voice we all wish was here is his. I was lucky to hear it on the page and in person. My first memory of Barry Lopez, it was of a man on rollerblades wearing very tight Speedos. And he had a live python wrapped around his neck. And he rollerbladed past me. This was not Barry Lopez. This was downtown Vancouver in 1997. My head was turned. I was not in Kansas anymore. I was not in Cambridge anymore. And I walked past that man, walked into the big bookstore that he'd just rollerbladed by. And there in front of me was a copy of Arctic Dreams, this copy here, which I still have, falling to bits, glue gone to tatters and pages brown, foxed and note covered. And I picked it up because it had an iceberg on the cover. I'd never heard of Barry Lopez. And I carried it. I carried it on a foot journey where every gram mattered, which was up the west coast of Vancouver Island on my own, not far from Fairy Creek, in fact, just west of that embattled ground. And I read it, and I left pemmican behind to carry Barry, but Barry was sole pemmican, and it astonished me, changed my life. It made me a writer. It blew open my notion of what nonfiction could do. This astonishing weaving, braiding, atomic collisions that were happening between voices and tones and ethics, so strong and so present, stepping forward from the first moment of the bow that Barry takes on that sunlit tundra. I had never met anything like it, and I've read that book more times now than I could say, pressed it on more people than I could say, and I wouldn't meet Barry for 22 years thereafter.
So what was your meeting like when you finally met each other face to face? It must have been a long time coming, and how did you receive each other?
Well, it was terrifying. I mean, he was a god to me. He was a distant lodestar. I never thought I'd meet him. He burned so brightly, and he showed the way to me. Rebecca has a beautiful line in her introduction to this book. She says, "I have my own paths now, but Barry helped me find them," which is what we always want writing to do. So perhaps I'm just here to say he did it, and he did that for me, as for, I now know, thousands of other people, with an unfailing generosity to other artists, other writers. But I was terrified. I came down the stairs in the hotel in Portland in 2019, where he was waiting for me with trembling legs. It was an overdetermined meeting on my part, because what could I say to the person who'd shaped my life? And a beautiful thing happened, which is that he got up. He was unwell at this time. He was in pain. He traveled a long way in the car to meet me, to greet me, to host me at the bookstore, and to do an event with me. And he sat down after he greeted me, typically courteously, and then he got out an atlas, and he opened the atlas, and he put it on the table in front of us, and he said, "Tell me some of the places you've been." And it was this, all my anxiety fell away. It was geography as generosity. Suddenly we had common ground, which was the whole world. We could turn pages, finger walk routes, countries, trade stories. It immediately put us on equal footing as earth beings, which was not, of course, how I felt, but it was such a simple and beautiful gesture. It felt absolutely typical of Barry and his work.
He was a very warm, creaturely person, a great hugger, and extremely comfortable in expressing warmth and intimacy, which sometimes man-to-man is a very difficult thing. And I wonder if there is any sort of English to American moment in that encounter, or if at some point your stiff upper lip melted away and you found yourself in a bromance.
I'm a hugger, trees particularly, but fellow writers too. And no, I thought there might have been an austerity or a distance. There was just a grace and a kindness. And we did the event. He met me afterwards. He gave me a stone, this stone from Antarctica, pressed it into my hand. I felt very strongly a passing on of a responsibility and a blessing. And as Barry was dying, I suppose this answers your question about sort of tenderness and closeness. Jim Warren, his great friend, and Deborah so kindly agreed to take receipt of poems that I read for Barry. I recorded them, Walt Whitman, Joy Harjo, Edward Thomas, and I would read them, some of them very, very long sections of Whitman, and I would send them to Deborah and via Jim, and she would she would play them to Barry in his final days. And there was a poem by Heaney that I thought I could just read the last lines of to end my section. It's a poem called Postscript. I think many might know it. If not, seek it out. It's short. It's very Lopezian, and it ends with these lines: "You are neither here nor there, a hurry through which known and strange things pass, as big soft buffetings come at the car sideways and catch the heart off guard and blow it open." And that's what Barry did to me, really. He caught my heart off guard time and time again as a person and a writer, and he blew it open. So I remember him with great love, great gratitude for the remote and proximate presence that he played in my life.
Oh, thank you, Rob, for that beautiful remembrance and those stories. Barry was a longtime lover of poetry and of language, and he had a talent for friendship in addition to having a talent for writing, and those two don't often necessarily go together, but he was a great friend to many writers and activists and collaborators, one of whom is the poet Jane Hirshfield, who's with us right now. Jane, do you want to come on and maybe give some thoughts and memories about your friend Barry Lopez?
Thank you. As for Robert, from the start of my adult life, Barry Lopez stood among the indispensable wisdom keepers. And I also never expected to know him in person. But then Orion Magazine convened one of its occasional meetings between staff and writers near Georgia O'Keeffe's Ghost Ranch in New Mexico. And, you know, Barry had as great a gift for friendship as he did for making other dreams, Arctic, Wolf, and beyond, come into the realms of existence. He insisted right away that we take a night walk that first night, and that began a conversation that didn't end. We knew each other as much through one another's work as we did through the conversations, letters, and emails. But books are one face of a life, the person as author. They offer the authority of revision, of distillation, a person's best offering. In his letters, especially, Barry was vulnerable, always unsure that he who had done so much had done enough, had served enough. A wise elder once told me that every human heart has in it a hole that can't ever be filled. We live our entire lives in its company and in its dread, and we make our choices because it is for each one of us there. Late in his life, Barry wrote the essays included in this new book in the section called Sky. They show the history of the abyss that was his to carry. When I read in Harper's the one called Sliver of Sky, I was harrowed. And Barry later sent me the balancing Madre de Dios in draft himself. The title of this new book, Embrace Fearlessly the Burning World, is Barry's answer to the unfillable hole. Some people flee into distraction, routine, fixed identity, frenzied striving. Some fall to exhaustion. Barry embraced the burning world, geological, oceanic, animal, humanly storied. He found his way to the actual by embrace of heat and cold, joy and grief. By entering with body, mind, and words, he found his way to the larger story that recalibrates all. And he found sentences that can make you swoon, found seeing that can make you swoon. Swooning too takes a kind of courage. Beauty only enters when we drop our guard. He also found the selflessness that underlies any great writing. One of the most pronounced qualities of Barry's speaking is the depth of its listening. I once called him in an earlier event for the Point Reyes bookstore the human equivalent of the very large array astronomical observatory outside Albuquerque, except that instead of being pointed at the stars, his observations pointed toward Earth, its denizens and beings, its stories and lives. One time we were asked to do an onstage conversation at the Key West Literary Seminars, and we both liked the subject we were given, but we hated the offered title and ended up talking on the phone for, 20, 45 minutes, trying to solve a single word. We finally landed on numinous, a word that comes etymologically from the gesture of nodding, of saying with the body, yes. In 2010, I was working in the H.J. Andrews experimental forest near Barry's Blue River home, and he did what he almost never did when he himself was working. He came to take me around in his ancient Toyota truck. He showed me how you could see the shape of a mouse burrowing into each sheath of a Douglas fir cone. He taught me to recognize wild ginger and suggested I should make some tea. He took me to a hot spring, sometimes hidden under the river's water. Seeing what mostly is hidden was his gift. Experience that enough times and you begin to understand something is always hidden. Your job is to find it, to become a person able to see this gift of more. If you have a sense of abundance, you behave generously. For 5 years, Barry endowed a residency in Hawaii for an emerging writer to do their work and give one public talk. He and Deborah asked Pico Iyer and Frank Stewart and me to help suggest and choose the writers, a quiet paying forward done simply because they could. Barry's yes to abundance and adventure was given not for thrill, greed, or to conquer, but to ask with abiding humility some essential questions. Barry, so unsure that his work had mattered, did that work not least because he was unsure. The unfillable hole in his and in all our hearts brought him to his rigor, his ethics, his tenderness, brought him to embrace his own inseparability from all fates. Barry's life wasn't lived at high altitude. It was grounded, intimate, and kept going by love. Not long ago, Deborah sent me a copy of the Neruda poem this book's epigraph is drawn from, kept in a dresser drawer by Barry for a very long time. And I'd like to finish by giving you, just as Robert did, some lines from the poem. It's long, so just 2 excerpts from this work that Barry so loved and in whose spirit he lived. These are both from the second part. The poem is I Ask for Silence. That, friends, is the sum of my wanting, next to nothing, close to everything. Now they may go if they wish. I have lived so much that someday they will have to forget me forcibly, rubbing me off the blackboard. My heart was inexhaustible. But because I ask for silence, never think I am going to die. The opposite is true. It happens. I am going to live. And I'm skipping some. It's a question of having lived so much that I wish to live that much more. Now, as always, it is early. The shifting light is a swarm of bees. Let me be alone with the day. I ask leave to be born. Thank you.
Jane, that was incredibly beautiful. Thank you so much. Each one of these tributes could be a miniature book in and of itself. Our next guest, Rebecca Solnit, is also a fellow traveler of Barry's, a writer and an activist, and I think a fellow interventionist in our times of emergency. Rebecca, please join us, and maybe if you could begin by just talking about your first encounters with Barry's work and how it affected or changed you.
And there's so many layers of being affected by his work, or at least 2 major layers. I was also quite young when I found Arctic Dreams. I'm now thinking that it may mark the difference between my first book, which is a very straightforward, objectively narrated history, and my second book, which is really titled in homage to it, Savage Dreams. which has a mix of deeply experiential first person narrative, historical and analytical recounting, with also something Barry gave us all: no fear of taking moral stances about things, of taking a clear position and not buying into being neutral in things, but also just the sheer beauty of Barry's work. Something about it felt different than all the nature writing that had come before, and kind of a permission to be deeply lyrical, deeply scientific, deeply historical, that all these things could coexist, that the categories in which writing is often divided, particularly I think in North America or in the English language, were not only unnecessary, they're border walls we should knock down, like so many border walls around us. So that was a huge influence, and also just this sense of what it meant to pay deep, close attention to the landscape, to derive identity, meaning, purpose, commitment, relationship from it. And I had grown up in the California landscape, like Point Reyes Books is now. I was on Coast Miwok land. I'm across the Golden Gate now on Ohlone land, also unceded. And there was, when I was growing up, almost no acknowledgement of Native people. And one of the things Barry did that was really valuable and important, that might not be easy for people to see now, because a lot of people do it now, but he was really early among settler white writers, deeply respectful of, interested in learning from Native people. He sought them out as living intellects in the landscape, not as historical traces. And they're big parts of his narratives. And so, so he helped make that shift. It's something I think about a lot, that a lot of times it's hard to see what's original about really important works of art, because they're no longer what we look at, they're how we see the world. And I think that's very true of Barry. So the natural work, the work about the natural world, about exploring and traveling and encountering, had a huge influence on me. And then I was really struck not by Sliver of Sky, which is a really bleak recounting of being sexually abused, essentially raped by a male friend of the family for a long time as a small child, but an earlier piece about the same subject told in a different way, called Frightening Abundance of Water, that does something really remarkable. It gave me a whole new sense of what memoir could be. I think we often think that introspection will save us, but I think as a kind of individualism, it can isolate us. And Barry talks about that abuse, but he talks about it in the context of two really important things that I think change his own experience and give us something I haven't always found in other work. One of which is he tells us what helped him survive that, what joy he found in the landscape, the freedom of moving through it on the bicycle, of his homing pigeons and their even more free flight through it. He would ride out as a little kid on his bicycle, let his pigeons go loose. So the landscape itself, the natural world, animals, open space, movement, travel, help save him. But he also does something where he acknowledges, and I think this is partly the presence of Deborah and her daughters, in a very deeply feminist way. He acknowledges that to be sexually abused, to be, oppressed, to be voiceless, is not an unusual, unique experience. I think also in this culture, we often think that to make our story important, we have to suggest that it's somehow exceptional or unique. And Barry really insisted that his experience was tragically ordinary, and throughout the piece expresses solidarity with the place that's Los Angeles, the natural world, the people of Los Angeles as it shifts into more and more an immigrant community, other people who've suffered these experiences. And that was a huge experience for me too. And just such a beautiful gift, that essay. And it was only published in the LA Weekly, and I had dearly treasured copies of it. It didn't circulate that widely, I think. And it's very exciting. It's anthologized in this wonderful collection of essays. And I think Barry's thought of as a nature writer, whatever the hell that is. And it's often in which is often a misnomer for people writing about ethics, spirituality, meaning, the cosmos, human relationships, possibilities, science, climate, etc. But then to finish the second part of, then I met him in person thanks to our mutual editor, Barbara Rass, and I'm going to just read a little bit of it. Barry often seemed serious, but he had a sly sense of humor in person and a capacity for delight. I met him the first time when we were both staying in Galisteo, New Mexico. And when we met, I told him he should see the life-size bear petroglyph hidden in the hills beyond. And while I knew there were thunderstorms pretty much every afternoon, he insisted on writing on every morning, so we set out as the white clouds gathered and began to darken into the color of a great blue heron's wings in flight. We walked, we talked. He often paused to examine a plant or a stone. We admired the bear petroglyph and the others surrounding it, including two great serpents zigzagging like lightning. And then the lightning itself came and the thunder, and a downpour that quickly soaked us to the skin. We crouched during the most torrential minutes of the downpour under a ledge, but it was impossible to stay apart from the rain and easy on that warm afternoon in an otherwise arid landscape, to yield to the delight of being. Baptized is the word that comes to mind in the storm. We had walked there on sandy soil, but we walked back on mud that turned our boots into clods. I wrote afterward about something that happened near the petroglyphs. I looked down to see he had left one perfect footprint, and in it lay a small pot shard striped red and black. That the footprint was not a minute old, and the fragment might have been lying there for 500 years, compressed two kinds of past into one dazzling encounter. The term walking in someone's footprints instantly became literal, for this was a writer whose work had long ago suggested to me something of what I might dare to aim for with mine. I have my own paths now, but he helped me find them, which is what we always want writing to do, so perhaps I'm just here to say he did it. Thank you so much, Barry. Thank you, readers who keep books alive, reading them long after we've written them, long after we may be gone, who keep the conversation going. Thank you, everyone here.
Rebecca, that was Rebecca Solnit reading from her gorgeous introduction to Barry Lopez's new book. If you're just joining us, Embrace Fearlessly, The Burning World. One of my favorite sentences in the book is a very typical Barry Lopez sentence in which he's having a conversation, much like the one that Deborah just described. He was a great citer of other scientists and other elders, people who knew things, who knew more than he did. And he writes in one essay, "Looking across the table at Faye that afternoon, I felt acutely the paucity of my own knowledge about walruses." And on that note, I'd like to bring in Bathsheba Demuth. Bathsheba, I feel like your work must clearly have emerged from some of Barry's tributaries. Do you want to talk a little bit about your experience in reading him or in meeting him or in both?
Yeah, thank you, John, and thank you, everyone. This has been a lovely event, and I hope that my terrible habit of being a sympathetic weeper does not kick in while I'm on screen. I realized listening to everyone that I come to this tribute with a very different relationship with Barry than all these other amazing folks, and that I actually never met him. And I had a brief moment of thinking that perhaps I should bow out of the conversation entirely, but then realized that perhaps my role at the end of this dialogue is to sort of stand in for all of the people who never did read him but came to know him so well on the page. That kind of tiny fragment in the mural of people that Barry has moved in his life, which also made me think about kind of where it is that he kind of came into my own life as a reader and as a person. Much like Rob, I have a terribly battered and much abused paperback version of Arctic Dreams. I don't know what they made paperbacks out of in the early 90s, but it's pretty stern stuff. And I started reading Barry far, far too young. I think I was probably 11 or 12. My parents had a copy of Arctic Dreams sitting around. I picked it up. I was, unlike Rob, had no idea what I was in the presence of. I was completely confounded and lost and baffled. But I knew that there was a there. Like I understood that something was happening in his words and these long rhapsodic discussions of muskox, in the invocations of a history that I didn't understand yet. So I took this copy of Arctic Dreams to the Arctic with me some years later when I moved up at 18. And I think it was there, and it was over the subsequent years of trying to figure out how to talk to people about experiences that we don't mutually share, that I really started to think about what it is that Barry does so well and so distinctly, and kind of what the there in his writing really is. I think he's singular on the page in his ability to make readers present with him, to kind of bring him into the world, to let them see where he is. There's kind of a radical transparency to that. And he lends us his curiosity, but in a way that doesn't list into arrogance. That line that you read about him sitting with Faye, who's a walrus biologist, who I'm also deeply indebted to, and just frankly being willing to say, here is a person who knows more about this fascinating creature than I do, and to be in his presence is an honor, is a move that I don't know if enough writers have the confidence to make. And it's an incredibly welcoming one.
I want to ask you a question, Bathsheba, since at some point Barry pointed out to me that all of his books in which there's a journey begin in Oregon. And he sort of follows his way down the river away from Oregon. And yet, you know, Horizon and many of the other books, he's traveled across 80 countries for research, and are taking place on lands far away from him that have different cultures and different belief systems and different plant and fauna life. Was there something that you took from Arctic Dreams or from About This Life, or for Desert Notes or Winter Notes, that made you think it was possible to travel far away from where you're from your own geography, with a light foot, and to do as little damage as possible in that traveling?
That's such a good question. And I think it's a good question because one of the things that I feel like I have really learned from reading Barry's work is not just having a light footprint in the kind of how to go backpacking sense, but how to leave a light footprint in the sense of how to be genuinely and deeply respectful of the places that you write about if you were an outsider, and to think carefully and fully and think with the people who are insiders to the place about what it is that needs to be represented to the broader outside world. And I think that, you know, one of the things that always impresses me in any of Barry's works, no matter where he's writing about, is that there's this capacity to move us between a kind of register that's in the divine and is awe in kind of an Old Testament sense, but that is also never outside of time, right? It's attentive to the histories of the continents that he's on. He never lets you kind of lose sight of the genocide or the xenophobia or the enslavement that are parts of places that humans have occupied, right? Like human failings are not something that he shies away from, and he's exacting about them. But I think also gives you the capacity to imagine with different ways of being, right? Sometimes through those amazing discussions of muskoxes and walruses, but sometimes also just really by paying attention to people. And that, I feel like many of his essays end with this kind of moment where he sort of invokes and brings us into imagining things in a way that really, you know, it's cognizant of the past, but also is really attentive to the present and the future that we could build together. And it's that kind of responsibility in his work that to me is kind of at the core of being in community. And even though I was never in his company directly, I think that piece of his legacy, that kind of demand that we pay attention and be responsible is really kind of core. And I think there's a line from this last and latest collection of his at the very end, of one of his essays where he said, "We will need to trust each other because today it's as if every safe place has melted into the sameness of water. We are searching for the boats that we forgot to build."
Thank you so much, Bathsheba. It was beautiful to hear from you. Now we have joining us on video another writer that Barry knew well and collaborated with and traveled with. He once, very late in his life, described a project that he was going to undertake with Colum McCann as to driving cross country in cars with a bird. I don't think that came to pass, sadly, but we have a video from Colum, who can't join us because he's not well. I think Random House can load that now.
Barry Lopez. We used to swap our favorite lines with one another, and one of his favorite lines, "Barbaric yawp. I sound my barbaric yawp across the rooftops of the world," which he's still doing and will always do. And another one of his favorite lines was from Osip Mandelstam, who said, "We must love this poor earth because we have not seen another." So much of his work is and was a prayer, and the deepest sort of prayer, and full of poetry. And we also used to swap a Wendell Berry poem, which I think is very touching and appropriate today. It's called "A Meeting." "In a dream I meet my dead friend. He has, I know, gone long and far, and yet it is me who has changed. For the dead are changeless, they grow no older. It is I who has changed, grown strange to what I was. And yet I, the changed one, walk up to him and say, 'How you been?' He grins and looks at me. I've been eating peaches off some mighty fine trees." I think Barry is eating peaches off some mighty fine trees. Deborah once told me that his last clear words were, "It's a glorious day." Well, it was such a sad time to lose him, but every day is a glorious day when you open up a Barry Lopez book. I'm profoundly aware of his influence across the world, across cultures. I met him first in Palestine, but I meet him virtually every single day in various places around the world, and I'm deeply grateful for him, his presence, and his writing. With thanks, all best wishes.
Barry didn't just collaborate with other writers and other scientists and indigenous elders. He was involved with potters, with visual artists, with photographers, with musicians, with bookmakers. And our next guest, John Luther Adams, the composer, will talk a bit about their friendship and also share, hopefully, a piece of music.
We called one another brother, and we meant it. Our childhoods had been similarly unsettled, and we both sought refuge in art, in the earth, and in our chosen family of people with whom we shared ties deeper than blood. Throughout almost 40 years of friendship, Barry and I drew encouragement from one another and from the feeling that we were doing the same work in different disciplines. Barry's work as a writer, like my work as a composer, was solitary. Yet, although we were usually thousands of miles apart, just knowing that Barry was in his studio doing his work made my own studio feel a little less lonely. Between our times together, we spoke regularly by telephone. On the winter solstice 2020, Barry and I had what we both knew was our last conversation. I could no longer deny the brittleness, the fragility that I heard in his voice. Unnerved, I found myself stammering to say something coherent. Clearly, Barry heard this, and as he'd done so many times before, he spoke directly to the heart of the moment. He told me that he and Deborah were creating a quiet space in which he could pass his final days, and that the next day he planned to listen to become river, become desert, and become ocean. I told him that I loved him. He told me the same. And then he said, I need to be quiet now. Your music now is the shape of my refuge. I felt released. Here I was struggling for words, while Barry, whose life's work was grounded in his deep, beautiful, resonant fluency with language, understood that it was time to move beyond words.
Now we will turn to Barry's wife, Debra Gwartney, who's been a big part of today's discussion of Barry's life, obviously, of putting together this magnificent book, Embrace Fearlessly the Burning World, which has, among many, many lines in it, it is a good idea to love each other and to love the earth. It felt like Barry was always trying to capture again what was important. Deborah, how are you feeling participating in all this and watching it?
Well, I am completely overwhelmed right now.
Yeah, it's a lot, isn't it?
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. I didn't mean to do this, sorry. Whoa, that music and those photos, goodness. And all of you, I have so much to say to every person who's spoken today, and the tremendous love that you all felt for Barry and that he felt for you. John, I just in particular want to say to you that he leaned on you so much and loved you so dearly. Thank you for, I would tease him that you were the son that he never had, and he really liked that idea. Not to take away from the marvelous relationship he had with the daughters and the grandchildren. I feel like right now what I need to do is just say thank you to everyone who's made this happen. And I must say thank you to Peter Matson, Barry's dear friend and agent, and a big thank you to Robin Desser, who Barry trusted her with his prose more than anyone. And thank you to everyone at Random House, to Molly and Carrie and Michael and Tangela and at Sterling Lord, Christopher and everyone over there. And I really must say thank you to three people who completely stepped up when after Barry's death, it became clear that there needed to be a book, and everyone wanted a book. But we had a bunch of disparate pieces, and because it was Barry, the disparate pieces were very tidy and beautifully prepared, but they were disparate. And then there was a fire, and then there was a very serious turn in his health. And so I needed a lot of help to start imagining what this book would be. And these three people just came in and poured themselves into the project. And they are Chris Jones and Julie Polhemus and Jim Warren. And I want to say that we came at it with such respect for who he was and is, and for his language. And it was a period of months like nothing I've ever experienced to be. I mean, I had a different relationship with Barry. We had a pretty darn ordinary domestic life with children and grandchildren and meals and walks and arguments and a cat. And suddenly I was deeply inside his writing life with this book. And I feel like I had the opportunity to know him in yet a different way, which caused me great sorrow, but also incredible joy. I think Barry felt like in the wake of Horizon, the central project of his life, that this book was a gift to the readers he cared so deeply about. And I think you know this, John, that until the last month of his life, he answered every single solitary letter he ever received from a reader. He spent hours and hours, especially after Sliver of Sky, writing people he never met and who would never meet. But anyway, I think this book is a retrospective, it's a way of thinking for the last several decades. And I'm thrilled about that. I want to say that Barry, just in our private conversations, was very, very worried about our fate as a culture and as a species. He had sleepless nights, many, but in this book, I just love that he doesn't take us into doom or hopelessness, but instead he really asks us to imagine a different way of being and another side. He died on Christmas Day of 2020, and less than 2 weeks later was January 6th, his birthday, and also the insurrection on the Capitol. And I stood there in front of the television and watched it unfold, and I thought, I really need Barry to be here. All of us need Barry to help us understand that this terrible tragedy and crisis could also be turned into transformation and change and hope. One of Barry's favorite words that he said to all of us here today was tender. He would often say to me, I think of her tenderly. I mean, that word tender came up so often, and he knew we had a capacity for tenderness that that he just drew on and draws on in this book. I'm not speaking anywhere nearly as eloquently as everyone else, but I just want to say that he was a wonderful man, husband, father to my daughters who he met as young children. And he came alive as a grandfather in ways that brought all of us great joy. I don't know what else, John. Thank you so much, everyone. And this book is a path, isn't it? It's just a path.
It does feel like he offers in his little book, this book, The Rediscovery of North America. He does what some of the guests brought up today, which is to acknowledge the destruction which has created the continent, what we think of as North America, and the genocides that led to that. And he describes in that book as struggling to want to be a purveyor of hope. And when I saw him in the last couple of years, I asked him about that. I said, do you still feel like that's your job? And he said, well, I'm not sure. I think maybe what I need to offer to some degree is comfort. And when I read all these essays together, I feel like they move beyond that definition and come up with a kind of radical framework for the idea of love, for love as a kind of activist idea, love as a kind of philosophy for how we live in the world as part of the natural world. And I wonder if you could end by talking a little bit about that, because it doesn't feel like a pantheistic easy love. It's a hard-won love. It's a love of sacrifice. It's a love also of tenderness. Mm-hmm. It's a love of the future. And I wonder if you have any observations about how he tacked towards that definition.
Wow, it's a beautiful question, and also it's just so observant of who he was in the world. I think there was a huge weight on his shoulders that he welcomed and carried beautifully to give the gift that was his to be this thinker and the writer that he was. He felt such a profound obligation to constantly be giving it away. And then how did I mean, this, I don't know if this answers your question, John, but the ways that he would take care of himself is that he would go for many hours in the woods with his friend Larry and cut wood. They would find dead trees and bring them down and bring them into our driveway, and for hour after hour, they would just cut and cut and cut wood. And nothing satisfied Barry more than that, just to kind of bring that energy and that strength and spirit together, and also a kind of tenderness toward the woods, because he was constantly watching and being its steward. Of course, he needed a lot of time alone, a lot. He was pretty darn good at pushing the rest of us away so he could have solitude, which was essential to his way of being. And, so he did have those edges where he would go far enough and then he'd have to withdraw. I guess I'll just also say that the burning of the property and the burning of his beloved community and his forest was, I just couldn't imagine how he was going to survive it. And for the few months that he was alive after the fire, he wanted to revisit that place over and over again. And he had this sifting mechanism that he could put into the ashes, and he would sift and sift and sift through the ashes of his archive, where he stored the 50-year history of his writing life. And every now and then some small little piece would come up that he would look at and save. He just really needed to do that sifting. He was in great sorrow over it, the loss of the archive. And then one day when we were sitting at the house where we'd rented in town because we could no longer live in our property, he said that he finally understood that the burning down of his 50 years of a writing life had liberated him, and that he was trying to understand what that liberation meant now. And I thought that was so brave of him to get to that place. And I think he wants for all of us to get there.
Well, Deborah, thank you so much for sharing that with us. The book is out now. It's called Embrace Fearlessly the Burning World. It is so beautiful and intimate and full of forms of wisdom, stories, encounters that only Barry could bring to the page in the way he does.